Good evening and welcome to another episode of Commander's Gridiron. I'm your host, Steve Lockman. And for those of you returning, thank you. Love to have you back. For those of you that are new to the show, welcome. And hopefully we can get you engaged for the next hour as we talk everything Washington Commanders. As a lot of us know, this past weekend was the unofficial start of the football season with the Hall of Fame game Thursday night, which brought about its share of problems, to say the least, as during the inaugural preseason game, the lights go out, not enough water for the showers for the guys afterwards. That's neither here nor there. But what the weekend's all about is the enshrinement of the annual class of Hall of Famers that takes place on Saturday. After the festivities of the preseason Hall of Fame game, the returning gold letter or the gold jacket signings, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that ties into the Washington Commanders this year, kind of as it does every year, is there's a particular name that pops up on the ballot for the Hall of Fame consideration, and that is past offensive lineman, Washington Redskins Hogs guru, Joe Jacoby. Joe Jacoby has put forth together a pretty spectacular career, one that is Hall of Fame worthy. However, he seems to be on the short end of the stick every year. And whether we like to admit it or not, he pretty much belongs there. When you look at some of the linemen that have entered the NFL Hall of Fame over the last 2 to 3 seasons, Joe Jacoby has the stats, has the accolades, and has the durability that warrants him to be in the Hall of Fame. What do we mean by that? Joe Jacoby played for the Washington Redskins for 12 years, from 1981 to 1993. During that time, Joe Jacoby became a 3-time Super Bowl champion with the Washington Redskins, now Commanders. He became a 3-time first-team All-Pro as he played left tackle, a 4-time Pro Bowler, and part of the 1980s All-Decade team for the NFL. He's also in the Washington Redskins Commanders Ring of Fame, as well as a Louisville Cardinal, for any of you college football fans out there. He's in their Ring of Honor too. So what makes Joe Jacoby so special? Well, every year when offensive line and offensive groups are ranked historically, the Washington Redskins, as we know them from back then, so let's just call them what they were, because Joe Jacoby never played for the Commanders. The Washington Redskins put together one of the most prolific offensive lines in NFL history, usually ranked in the top 5 every year for the best offensive lines in NFL history, as I just stated. So in 1982, offensive line coach Joe Bugle, who recently passed away a couple years ago, dubbed the term the Hogs, per se, during a preseason training camp. And affectionately, from there on out, by the fans, local media, even national media, a group of gentlemen who anchored the Washington Redskins for many years, with a couple come and goes, were commonly known as the Washington Hogs. The Hogs actually started in 1982, consisted of Russ Grimm, who's, as note, the only current Hall of Famer for the Hogs from that era. Joe Jacoby, who's on the ballot every year. Jeff Bostic, who played center. Mark May, a lot of you may know him from College Game Day and College Gaming, who played right guard. George Stark, who played right tackle. Fred Dean, who was a guard, who was in that group as well. And tight ends Don Warren and Doc Walker. Those men predominantly made the Washington Hogs, started that group, and played together for about 8 to 10 years. A couple other gentlemen came through. Mark Schlereth, 3-time Super Bowl champ, not only with the Washington Redskins, but the Denver Broncos, and a couple other gentlemen as well. So not only should Joe Jacoby be in the Hall of Fame for next year, but a few of the other names on that list for the Hogs should be as well. what makes Joe Jacoby so special this year is not only has he been not gotten the nod over the last couple of years, but he's now on the seniors list. The seniors list is actually whittled down their finalists to the final 12. Um, and they have a meeting, I think it is August 15th or around the 20th, to whittle that list down even further. Unfortunately, one of the things that I have come to learn since last year's process for the seniors list is that the team and a representative of the team and a representative of the player kind of go to bat pretty hard for these individuals, and that's kind of how they get selected, right? It's not just the selection committee making their selections, but it's all about the pitches for that person making that player, former player, kind of their hype man, kind of being their, it's kind of being their representative or their spokesperson to try and get them into the Hall of Fame. So with the current new ownership, you might see that push being made for certain individuals in team history kind of now having that chance to make the Hall of Fame. As much as we hate to talk about Dan Snyder never really made that push for former players to be in the Hall of Fame. But I think this could be Joe Jacoby's year, that he makes the cut, becomes a finalist, hopefully makes it into the Hall of Fame for 2024. As we talk Hall of Fame, there's a couple other gentlemen on the team that certainly could be worthy of Hall of Fame nods. But one of the things that kind of goes into looking at Hall of Famers is, did they have the Hall of Fame career, or are they just really good players? As I looked across the board, kind of going back from like 2000 back, there's about a list of 6 to 7 guys that I came up with, and one of those guys, we'll start at the top of the list, was Chris Samuels. Chris Samuels was an offensive lineman, played his whole career with the Washington Redskins, went to Alabama, prolific offensive lineman, rarely got hurt, was consistent on the line, good blocker, multiple Pro Bowler, first team, and it kind of goes from there. Santana Moss, as everybody knows, kind of played two teams for the most part in his career between Washington and New York Jets. Prolific wide receiver, cowboy killer as he was known in DC, and put up some stats, but are they Hall of Fame worthy? Probably not. Fan favorite Chris Cooley, played his entire career with Washington. Kind of that tight end, halfback, kind of the slot before it was really a position. Put up good numbers, consistent, productive guy, multiple year Pro Bowler. But is it Hall of Fame worthy? Probably not. Really good player, really good stats. Might not make that Hall of Fame echelon. Joe Theismann, one of the favorites of team history. Super Bowl winning quarterback, Super Bowl MVP. Infamously broke his leg from Lawrence Taylor at the end of kind of midway through the season. Basically derailed the rest of his career for all intents and purposes. Did have some Hall of Fame numbers, but is it quite up there to being Hall of Fame worthy? Maybe. There's definitely some other guys that, around the league, when you look and comparing numbers, he's probably not better than. So even though he is in the Washington Ring of Fame, he's probably not quite Hall of Fame worthy. The last two gentlemen, one would probably make it, would be Sean Taylor. However, Sean Taylor's career was cut short in 2017 when he was tragically shot to death at his home in Miami after the break-in. He was on pace to have that Hall of Fame career, had stellar numbers, had a significant presence on the defensive side of the ball. Highlight video after highlight video of him just annihilating people left and right. Wide receivers, running backs, punters. He played special teams. He did it all. He was out to do one thing, and that was make a presence for the defensive side of the ball. With his career being cut short, I don't think he has the numbers to make it into the Hall of Fame, but he's definitely one of the higher profile Washington players in history. And as Paul Spencer alluded to just a couple minutes ago, London Fletcher. London Fletcher, aside from the gentleman on the Hogs, who should be in consideration with Joe Jacoby, London Fletcher needs to be right up there for Hall of Fame. London Fletcher has very comparable, if not better stats than Ray Lewis. Let that sink in for a minute, okay? London Fletcher played the same amount of time as Ray Lewis. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to pull up the exact stats right before the show, but when you look at the tracker for Ray Lewis and you put them side by side with London Fletcher, literally they are within digits of tackles, of sacks, of hurries, of rushes, of fumbles, of everything that you can think of. They are super comparable. The only thing that London Fletcher doesn't have that Ray Lewis does is a Super Bowl championship. However, if we're going number for number, pound for pound, London Fletcher is just as good, if not better, than Ray Lewis. He just doesn't have the fame and notoriety as Ray Lewis does. But London Fletcher deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. Moving forward, one of the other things that, as we look at Hall of Fame consideration, especially as we kind of wrap up the discussion with Joe Jacoby, Joe Jacoby was working side by side with Rush Grimm, who is currently an NFL Hall of Famer, which kind of puzzles the average fan and even the diehard Washington fan, that how can we have one hog in a Hall of Fame and not another one or two or three or four? But one of the things that everybody knows Joe Jacoby for is the infamous John Riggins touchdown run in the 1983 Super Bowl against the Miami Dolphins that, it's on every highlight reel for Super Bowls. It's on every highlight reel for Commanders and Redskins history. And it's also the same Super Bowl that the Washington Redskins set the NFL record for 276 rushing yards. I think that, as Ken Fry says, below, Ray Lewis had the better PR group, and I can't argue with that, right? As I alluded to earlier in the discussion, a lot of the Hall of Fame pitches and when it comes down to selection is done by what your PR group can do for you, what is done on your behalf to advocate to get you through the selection committee, especially when you're on the senior panel Hall of Fame group listing. But like I said, within the next week or two, we will see how that list gets shortened down. I think they're shortening it to 6 or 9. They're at like 12 or 15 right now. And that list will get whittled in half for future consideration. One of the other things, kind of off the field, so to speak, that we wanted to look at tonight as we talk Commanders football is Josh Harris. We kind of already talked about the owner perspective of how the team was sold, what he's bringing to DC, the changes he wants to make, his vision, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things I kind of wanted to dive into tonight a little bit deeper was what can Josh Harris deliver to DC? Can fans expect to get that Super Bowl with Josh Harris at the helm, along with his other managing partners, Magic Johnson, Mitchell Rales, Mark Ein, and so on and so on? So I kind of did some research and looking at Josh Harris and the other teams that he owns and the other stakes that he has into different sports, and kind of wanted to also throw it out to anybody that's watching, anybody that's listening, chime in. I'd love to hear your take on this. But Josh Harris and his managing sports partner group, Harris Blitzer Sports Management, bought the Philadelphia 76ers in 2011. Now, obviously, basketball is vastly different from football. However, the Sixers have not won a championship in the 12 years that Josh Harris has been owner or managing partner of the 76ers. Is that any cause for concern? Does that make Washington football fans uneasy? Does it make them optimistic? Does it make them pessimistic? I'm not quite sure. The last 2 or 3 seasons, the Philadelphia 76ers have been putting some of the right pieces in place to make deep runs into the playoffs. Sometimes they get eliminated in the first round. Sometimes they get eliminated in the second round. They're just not making it to the finals of the NBA to get that first championship under Josh Harris. How is that going to correlate getting close, or not getting close at all in most years to the football team in DC? Second team that we're looking at with Josh Harris. Josh Harris is also managing owner, or with the Harris Blitzer Group of the New Jersey Devils. They purchased this team in 2013. Now, if you look at the New Jersey Devils hockey history, they are a three-time Stanley Cup champion. However, none of those Stanley Cups have come in the last decade while Harris has been at the helm of the New Jersey Devils. The New Jersey Devils, though, have been sneakily good, kind of under the radar over the last year and a half. They actually made it really far into the playoffs this year. And they're definitely putting some solid teams out on the ice to be competitive. However, once again, that's not necessarily translating into conference championships, finals championships, or even finals appearances. So what does that mean for us? As Danny on Wheels 43 says, having new owners is a start to that process and a start to that culture, right? And I'll have to agree with that. That obviously when we were going back under the Snyder era and the 2 decades plus, it's kind of like having a fantasy football owner at the helm, right? That he would try to put an all-star group onto the field to be competitive every year. However, it just wasn't getting it done when we only have 4 playoff appearances in 20 years, not making it past the first round or even sometimes the wild card. But Harris is going to bring that change of culture. Harris is going to bring that optimism and that positivity that can the new owner deliver. One of the things that's super intriguing as a diehard fan and now show host, at least from my perspective, is Josh Harris is really big on analytics. A lot of pro sports owners and teams are going into the route of analytics to kind of help make the decisions, drive the direction of the team, speaking football, offense, defense, looking at certain situations and the percentages of success or what they should do. Third down, short distance, third down, long distance, 4th and 1, 4th and 3, 4th and long, 2nd and long, and everything. So how is that new analytics perspective going to come into play? I can tell you that Ron Rivera is old school, right? Ron Rivera is kind of old guard from the old NFL, played in the NFL, was a good player for the Chicago Bears back when, and has been a coach for 10, 15 years now. Never really a big analytics guy. Even in his 4 years so far here in DC, hasn't really used analytics very much. It's been pretty evident in some of his play calls, some of his time management, some of his timeouts, some of his, challenges, both defensively and offensively. So how is this new perspective with Josh Harris and the vision that he has going to be coming in to play with Ron Rivera, EB, as well as some of the other guys that, our coach Jack Del Rio, for example, and how much their decisions are going to be impacted by the analytics that we get. As Paul says, he's going to spend the money. I give him that. But for fans, we have one goal, and that's the championship. Something that's not on this owner's list yet, right? And you're exactly right. So, can we be the team that delivers the first championship to Josh Harris? I'm going to be completely honest with you that I don't see that happening in 2024, 2023, 2024. This coming season. Is it something that can happen in 24, 25? Quite possibly. We have a lot of the starting pieces and a lot of the major building blocks to make that happen. We have some wide receivers. We have a decent tight end. We have what is projected to be a decent quarterback. But that's kind of what the 2 biggest question marks right now on the team is quarterback, offensive line. If the defensive unit that's on paper produces like they are on paper, we're going to have another top 5 defense in the league. We started out really slow defensively last year, ended up being a top 10 defense. The year before that, started out somewhat slow, first 6 games, ended up being a top 10 defense. The problem is there was never an offense that could match the defense or even be better to help those guys out in scoring the points and winning games. It always seemed to be on the defense backs every game, every season. So maybe that will change. Moving forward, one of the other things that kind of brought up before we go on the field with training camp, was a recent article / interview from Albert Haynesworth. Albert Haynesworth, as you may recall, was actually one of the first gentlemen NFL players that signed a $100 million NFL contract. He had actually been playing for Tennessee before Dan Snyder had actually swooped in and got him. He was one of the gentlemen that, was part of, as I call it, the fantasy football players, where a lot of guys would come in through Dan Snyder at the end of their career. Jason Taylor, Albert Haynesworth, Bruce Smith, Deion Sanders, the list goes on and on. If you think of an elite player, probably even a Hall of Famer, at some point in time, he probably played 1 to 2 seasons at the very end of his career for Washington. And Albert Haynesworth was one of them. But Albert Haynesworth recently did an interview with a sports media guy, not in the DC market, which was kind of interesting, but he had some unique things to say about not only Dan Snyder, but about some of the guys that he had played with, who to most DC fans are icons in Commanders history, icons that played, tremendously, are fan favorites, are, perennial Pro Bowlers, etc. So one of the things to kind of paint the backstory, or as my wife says, I get into the weeds of talking. Albert Haynesworth did a 2-year stint in DC. He played for 2 different coaching staffs, which probably didn't help him out. Had a really, how do I want to describe it, as a wildfire type perspective and difference of opinions and visions on coaching styles during those 2 different head coaching eras. The first one was Jim Zorn. Jim Zorn didn't last very long. I think he only made it like 3/4 of the way through his first season, compiled a shitty record and was canned after the halfway through the season or at the end of the season. Lasted 1 season as head coach. And so he didn't really have anything or any power to rebut Albert Haynesworth, his views, his stance on defense, his energy, his work ethic, anything like that. However, the next coach that came in did, and that was Mike Shanahan. Basically, Mike Shanahan wasn't going to put up with anybody's crap, no matter how they were getting paid, what their contract was, what their status was. You were there to perform. If you didn't do your job, you were basically eligible to be cut, traded, demoted, whatever word you want to say. So Mike Shanahan did just that. After 2 seasons, Mike Shanahan got rid of Albert Haynesworth's contract, which was absolutely ridiculous, traded him to New England in 2011 for a 5th-round draft pick. And I think he only lasted like 4 to 5 months in New England before he moved on from there. And as Danny on Wheels 43 says, we had plenty of bad coaches in our team's history, but I have to agree that Spurrier was another bad hire. They thought Spurrier, kind of as a side note, they thought Spurrier was going to be pretty awesome because he was very prolific with the Florida Gator offense as a college coach. However, Steve Spurrier struggled to make that transition from college coach to NFL coach, managing the players, managing offense, trying to call the offense while he was here and doing that, and just never meshed well, wasn't successful, had a really short term, and went back down to the college ranks. I'm pretty sure he went to South Carolina after his stint with Washington and actually became pretty successful, pretty decent there in the college ranks. However, getting back to the interview that Albert Haynesworth did with this particular reporter, he went on record to say that he was actually good friends with Dan Snyder. Actually says he talked to him about once a week, even up until recently with everything going on with investigations. And up until about the beginning of the sale process over the last 6 to 8 months, he was actually on a fairly friendly basis with Dan Snyder. Called him a good owner, called him a decent friend, said, hey, I never got the asshole vibe. He's super cool and not an asshole. So, but as Paul just said, when the owner signs that fat check for $100 million over 7 years, I'd probably say the same thing too, right? Like, hey man, this guy's pretty awesome. However, where the interview turned sour was when he was asked his opinion about former players on the team that he played with. And Albert Haynesworth's direct quote was, he called all the former players, which I'll name in a minute, a joke, and said they represented what the team represented back then, which was trash, end quote. The players that Albert Haynesworth decided to reference and call out in his interview was cornerback D'Angelo Hall, running back Clinton Portis, tight end Chris Cooley, and wide receiver Santana Moss. As I alluded to earlier, especially with guys that are in the current Washington Ring of Fame, and some who have Hall of Fame numbers but may not quite be Hall of Fame worthy, all of those guys, except for D'Angelo Hall, were in that conversation. So as you can imagine, DC media, bloggers, Twitter, podcasters have been blowing up this Albert Haynesworth story over the last 2 to 3 days like it's been wildfire, right? How dare you, as a guy who came in, signed a $100 million deal, probably one of the worst contracts in NFL history, come in and literally just trash some of the best players and longevity players that Washington had during your tenure, who produced better than you did, even though you were defensively, and turn around and get up and walk out. It's very puzzling why he did it. It didn't seem like he was instigated or somebody started some beef on Twitter or anything else. It's just something that randomly popped up as one of the sports reporters asked a question in the interview, and it was just really something that stuck out. And for Washington fans, was like, yo, dude, like, what the hell? Why? Why would you trash your players, trash fan favorites, and all around good DC ball players? So at this time, we're going to take a quick break, talk about our sponsors for Commanders Gridiron, as well as Out of the Box Sports Network. And I know the first sponsor that we have tonight is actually our Dugout Mugs, brand new sponsor. You can use the code there at the bottom, Out of the Box Sports 20 at dugoutmugs.com to get 20% off your mugs. These are pretty cool. They make them in mugs. They make them in shots, kind of like shot glass style. Any team, any logo, you can get them personalized. Use that code at the bottom, dugoutmugs.com. Get your Dugout Mugs today. Next sponsor is Monkey Cult Coffee. So you can use the promo code Out of the Box Sports at monkeycultcoffee.com. At checkout, the owner, Matt, donates 10% of each sale to the National Pediatric Foundation. Awesome cause. They got some new flavors, including bourbon chocolate chip and toasted coconut rum. So log on, get your coffee, get your products, get your apparel, and use that promo code Out of the Box Sports at Monkey Cult Coffee for your discount there as well. And last but not least, we have 1-800-HURT-123, Attorney Big Al, which is Jason Fine, aka Attorney Big Al, which is attorney at law. 3 office locations throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and Philadelphia, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Pittsburgh, PA. If you have any legal needs or need protection, call 1-800-HURT-123 and talk to Big Al. All right, so as we get to one of the last parts of the show tonight, which will probably take the most or the longest, is actually training camp updates and training camp happenings. One of the things that's kind of interesting is, every year after the first week or so, as we kind of go into the second week of training camp, a depth chart gets released. And the Washington Commanders are not immune to that depth chart getting released as well. So one of the things that got brought out, and it's kind of interesting, does Ron Rivera make the depth chart? Does EB? Does Jack Del Rio? Is it an intern? It's basically just given a list of names, that we kind of look at and say, okay, these are where the guys kind of rack up. So one of the things, as Daniel Wheels just said, you got to start at the quarterback level, right? So right now, Sam Howell's listed as QB1. Jacoby Brissett is listed as QB2. And Jake Fromm, who played his ball time at University of Georgia, is actually QB3. we don't know what we're going to get out of our quarterbacks yet. I think they set that particular order. That's kind of who gets the majority of snaps right now in training camp in that order is Howe, Brissett, and Fromm. One of the questions that remains to be seen in preseason game number 1 against Cleveland this week is how much Sam Howell is going to play. I've literally heard everything from Sam Howell is going to play one quarter, one half. He could play none at all. It remains to be seen. I think personally, as a diehard fan, you want to see Sam Howell on the field for the Cleveland preseason game as much as humanly possible. Other than the Dallas game last year and the QB1 snaps and reps that he was taking in practice at the very end of the season last year after they benched Taylor Heineke and decided to go to Sam Howell for week 18, game 17 last year. Sam Howell needs the reps. It's a new offense for Sam Howell. It's a new offensive coordinator for Sam Howell and Eric Bieniemy, who came from Kansas City, who's been ruffling some feathers and making waves here lately, which we'll talk to in a little bit. But as he tries to master that offense that EB is bringing, he needs the reps. He needs the time. He needs to get more comfortable with his wide receivers, his tight end, his offensive line, which is suspect to begin with. We'll talk about those positions here in a second. So one of the X factors for the bulk of the season, especially the first quarter, is what are we going to get out of Sam Howell? So for the intern, Sam Howell's QB1. One of the things that kind of is intriguing, to say the least, there's 3 position groups, especially on offense. We kind of know our starting wide receivers, right? Wide receiver 1, Terry McLaurin. Second behind Terry McLaurin is Dyami Brown, who was looked upon last year as given a little bit bigger role, was given more targets towards the beginning to middle of the season, was somewhat productive with those targets and opportunities for a short period of time. And then those opportunities tended to go away, right? He wasn't making the most of them. He wasn't overly productive with those opportunities. What happens in the NFL when you're not producing? You go right back to sitting on the sidelines while other guys are coming in to get that opportunity to play those plays, run those routes, possibly make some touchdowns, make some catches, the yards after the catch, et cetera, et cetera. The second wide receiver, as we kind of always knew, was Jahan Dotson. Surprisingly, the number 2 wide receiver to Jahan Dotson is Byron Pringle. As we talked about last week, Byron Pringle was brought in as a free agent. He played the bulk of his career, 3 out of 4 of the last 4 years with Kansas City, with EB in that offense. He wasn't a wide receiver number 1, maybe not even a wide receiver number 2, but he was between 2 and 3, and somewhat productive in the offense that EB ran in Kansas City. He went to Chicago last year. We kind of all know how Chicago went, which was basically the Justin Fields show. If Justin Fields wasn't running for his life, he might be able to get some passes off here and there. So a lot of guys weren't as productive in Chicago as they probably could have been last year. And Byron Pringle was one of them. So Byron Pringle comes over to DC this year to kind of rejuvenate himself, reunite with EB, and see how he can interact with the offense for the Commanders. One of the things of note for Byron Pringle is he already knows the offense. He knows the terminology. He knows the routes. He knows the plays. He knows the motion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that he's been noted by many team insiders at camp every day is he is working with predominantly the 2s, but every once in a while comes in and works with the 1s. Comes in, runs a couple routes, makes a couple catches with the 1s, goes right back on the sideline. But rather than stand on the sideline and watching and kind of just, not really being engaged, he's over on the sidelines almost all the time, interacting with the wide receiver 1s, McLaurin, Dotson, and Curtis Samuel, who we'll talk about in a moment, but also the guys that are trying to make the backups in Dyami Brown, Dax Milne, Casimir Allen, and so on and so forth. So, in helping those guys to learn the offense, learn the terminology, where they're supposed to be, where they're going, misdirections, et cetera, et cetera. So, which kind of brings us to our next point. Curtis Samuel right now is listed as wide receiver number 3. Curtis Samuel started off really hot last year with Carson Wentz, had that connection. lot of long balls, a lot of mid to long balls, was making reception, had some touchdowns, tweaked his leg a little bit here and there, which kind of didn't really help him out. Carson Wentz went downhill, as we all know, and was replaced with Taylor Heineke. Taylor Heineke comes in, didn't quite have the relationship with Curtis Samuel that Carson Wentz did. So therefore, the opportunity for Curtis Samuel declined, right? That's when you saw an emergence of Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin and even AG out of the backfield for Taylor Heineke, because those were the guys that he really felt comfortable with and had that relationship with. So I wouldn't be surprised if Curtis Samuel isn't even a number 3. Last year of the contract, probably won't get renewed by Washington after the season unless he completely balls out, which I honestly don't really see happening. I see him having that wide receiver 3 season for us this year. And behind him is actually Dax Milne, who's basically been kept around for special teams. Didn't really appear too many games last year. Didn't get too many catches. Even if he was in the game, he was on the opposite side of the play. Wasn't really a big presence. One of the things that kind of is the competition battles is tight end. Logan Thomas is slated as number 1, John Bates number 2, Cole Turner number 3. Logan Thomas hurt himself again this past weekend on Sunday. Had off yesterday, had off what I think was today as well. That, to many fans, we see this repeat of basically the Jordan Reed era. Jordan Reed was kind of like a tier 2 Travis Kelce, George Kittle, not quite up to that level, but the next tier down. When he was on the field, prolific, great route runners, great ball catchers, great blockers. Problem is staying on the field. So can Logan Thomas stay on the field? He's a long vet. He's got 10 years into the league. Took the vet day off yesterday. Was it tied to the injury that he sustained over the weekend? We don't know. Ron Rivera is very hesitant on how to call guys with their days off. If a veteran's having a day off, just call it veteran day off. But Ron Rivera has kind of gone back to this whole with Logan Thomas. We're still recovering from the injury. Logan Thomas's big injury was 2 seasons ago, kind of like with Chase Young, right? Even a little bit before that. So, is he really not back to 100% from the injury? Is it something new? Are we going down this road with Jordan Reed? The question then becomes is it something that we should have addressed in the draft or better in free agency with tight end? The reason I say that is EB, the new offensive coordinator, loves his tight ends, loves to run 2 tight ends, sometimes even 3 tight end packages. The problem is I'm not so sure that we have the personnel to run those packages consistently more times than what we did last year. So that remains to be seen. One of the things of note is they currently have Charles Leno starting left tackle, Sadiq Charles left guard, Nick Gates starting center, right guard Sam Cosmi, right tackle Andrew Wiley, who came over from Kansas City, and that's kind of like the starting line for now. One of the things, as Paul says, do I see any O-line surprises? The kid from Strongburg from Arkansas, right? So they drafted Strongburg in the 3rd round. Something that's really interesting was I was listening to a podcast by J.P. Finley, who has his own DC radio show as well as one of the Commander Insiders every day, was actually talking about this battle at center. Ricky Stromberg was a guy that he drafted in the 3rd round, but when he talked to other people around the league, it's somebody that could have been drafted 4th round, 5th round, probably even the 6th round, right? So then it kind of raises some red flags. It's like, well, why did Washington take him in the 3rd round? Is he not producing in camp, to make a better impact, so to speak, at center? So right now it's Nick Gates. Right now the backup center to Nick Gates is Tyler Larson, with Ricky Stromberg being 3rd. So is that because he's a product of what should have been a later round draft pick instead of a 3rd round? Is he not producing as much as they thought he was? Is he more of a project piece? 2-3 years down the line from here, we shall see. One of the things that's kind of unique to watch is the battle at left guard, left tackle. So I think that Andrew Wiley and Sam Cosmi have basically the right side locked down. The problem is that the left side is still kind of undecided. It's kind of our weak spot. But the problem is it can't be our weak spot because it needs to be the strong spot. So right now, Charles Leno is slated as the tackle 1. Cornelius Lucas is tackle 2. Sadiq Charles is left guard number 1. Chris Paul is number 2. However, Chris Paul has had a really awesome training camp. Don't be surprised if Chris Paul jumps Sadiq Charles to play left guard. And even Lucas may jump Leno to play left tackle. But they're pretty interchangeable. One of the things that makes this offensive line group suspect, so to speak, is the fact that we have a lot of new guys. We have guys changing positions. Cosmi is playing guard this year, but Cosmi played tackle last year. Is it really that big of a difference? Probably not. He's a more natural fit to play guard in EB's system. As Paul just alluded to, there's a lot of motion, a lot of misdirection, a lot of trying to fool the defense with formations and the movement of those players in your formation sets. So Cosmi might be that better fit at the guard with Wiley playing tackle. Left side, we don't know yet. It's a matter of these guys meshing, a lot of these guys getting more reps, a lot of these guys playing together more, which kind of leads back to, as we go into preseason games, how much are these guys going to play? I think these guys need to play at least the first quarter, maybe even the first half together, get that mesh, get that goal. One of the things that's going to help these guys practice, get better mesh together, get more cohesion, get more fluid, understanding and communication together, is they're going against one of the best defenses in training camp. Somebody alluded to it the other day, one of the coaches, that it's basically iron sharpening iron. When you're going up against Montez Sweat, Chase Young, Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne every day in practice, you can't do anything but get better, right? Or else you're going to get burnt every single play. You're going to be toasted. You're going to be pushed on your butt. You're going to be driven back. You're going to be made to look like the fool in training camp if you don't get better. And we've seen that steadily happen from time to time throughout different training camp days, of the offense having a little bit better day than the defense. And then, you'll read about or see clips of the defense having that better day than the offense. So speaking of defense, not a whole lot's changed on the defensive side of things. We kind of know the front four, right? As I just alluded to: Sweat, Payne, Allen, and Chase Young. But you also have Toohill, Ridgeway, Mathis, and Williams, which are a pretty good, solid number 2s. That can obviously rotate in, give those guys a break when needed, but we're predominantly leaning on those massive front 4. One of the things to note, it's kind of interesting, and I think they did it just so they don't cause waves or have people like me and reporters in the media ask questions. But right now, offensive linebacker number 1 is Jamin Davis. For those of you that don't know, Jamin Davis was actually in a car accident with a DUI, and something else happened. Personal injury. I don't think it was death. However, Jamin Davis just had a recent court date last week. Went in with a plea deal to have minimal jail time yet to serve. I think it was like 2 weeks or something like that. Massive fine, hundreds of hours of community service, suspended sentence, the coursework for alcoholics driving, like you name it, yada, yada, yada. Whole laundry list of stuff. The judge rejected that plea deal in the court hearing. So now I think it's at the end of the month, August 31st, or like at the beginning of September, that he has another court date to figure out to come back with another plea deal that's acceptable to the judge, or the judge will hand down another series of punishments. So there's a probability, let's call it 50-50 right now, that Jamin Davis isn't even available come week 1, but that remains to be seen. However, the gentleman listed at number 2 for outside linebacker is Khaleke Hudson. Khaleke Hudson's been turning some heads here lately in training camp, which is nothing but positive for him and the defense. So I wouldn't be surprised if he actually jumps Davis, because Davis has been off every other day, every third day here lately to deal with his court shit. So it gives an opportunity for Hudson to come in, practice with the ones, play with the ones on 7-on-7, 11-on-11 in the drills, and make that impact for him as he tries to vie for a valuable spot on the roster. Middle linebacker is right now is Cody Barton, who we signed from Seattle in the offseason, back up by David Mayo. Barton is kind of that given in the middle linebacker. We brought him in from Seattle for that reason after Cole Holcomb left on a free agent deal to go to the Pittsburgh Steelers this season. So we needed somebody to fill that gap. One of the things that's pretty interesting, too, as the NFL goes to that pass-happy, passing offensive-minded strategy and perspective, is that for one of the first times that I've noticed or actually recognized, it might have happened last year, but I just didn't really catch on to it. The Commanders are listing their depth chart as 4 up front, our stout 4 that we kind of talk about every week, 2 linebackers, middle backer, outside linebacker, and then basically 5 in the secondary as their primary defense. A lot of times teams will either go into a nickel package or kind of have that third backer who is also a safety-ish type person, kind of a Swiss Army knife, jack of all trades for defense, so to speak. But it's kind of interesting that Washington jumps right to it and says, hey, look, this is what we're bringing you. We're going to bring a 4-2-5 defense, basically. Since, the majority of the times, offensive teams are going pass. Hey, with our front 4 and our 2 linebackers, we feel we can stop the run. We're going to focus on the pass. So with that being said, we have three groups of cornerbacks listed: McKendall Fuller, Benjamin St-Juste, and the rookie Emmanuel Forbes. All solid guys. The problem is there's the guys behind them is Quan Martin, Rashad Wild Goose, Danny Johnson. Solid guys. Martin is the guy that they drafted in the second round, who is, as I just alluded to a couple of minutes ago, is that Swiss Army knife, jack of all trades for the defense. He can be all over the place. He can play free safety, strong safety. He can play cornerback. He can play nickel. He's maybe just a little short in stature and size to play outside linebacker, but a good cover guy for your tight ends or your slot guys, or even or running backs out in the field, the McCaffreys and stuff like that. So I see him being used a lot, even though he's listed as number 2. As Paul says, how do I feel at safety? Obviously we're starting Cam Curl. Right now, the free safety is Derek Forrest, with the 2 guys behind them being Jeremy Reaves and Percy Butler. However, Jeremy Reaves is no slouch of his own. Jeremy Reaves made the Pro Bowl last year, not only for defense, but more for special teams. However, he has had that impact as the second line of safeties for our team. So Cam Curl's a ball hawk. Cam Curl's a dog. We all know that. He's going to become a free agent after this season. I see Washington trying to re-sign him to the long-term deal, probably before the first half of the season, to keep him under contract. What does that mean for Derek Forrest and Jeremy Reaves and Percy Butler? Some of those guys are kind of playing out the end of their rookie contracts, so they're playing for longer deals, playing for bigger paydays. But I see Reaves being an integral part with Cam Curl and Derek Forrest. If Reaves plays the way he can, Reaves might even go into more of a cornerback-ish hybrid position, nickelback with Quan Martin, that I see Jack Del Rio kind of going into as well. One of the things that fans call for Jack Del Rio is we need to blitz more. Well, the problem is we don't necessarily have the personnel to blitz per se. We only have 2 linebackers, maybe one of the 5 in the secondary coming off the edge, to do that blitzing. However, I looked at an interesting stat this past week that said only 46, the average blitz rate of the NFL last year was only 40 to 46%, which is kind of interesting, right? You kind of think that it would be over the 50% threshold. But Washington kind of ranked in around the 35 to 40% mark. So kind of below the NFL average for blitzing at the 40-45 or down in the 30s. But that kind of goes back to, can the front 4 put the rush on, not necessarily the blitz, to make the quarterback hurry the throws, make throws that he's not comfortable with, throw batted balls, get their arms up. and even result in some sacks because the secondary is doing their coverage. I think our secondary has gotten immensely better than we were last year if the guys can play to their potential. As I alluded to at the beginning of the show, on paper, we have a top 10, maybe even a top 5 defense. The guys need to stay healthy, they need to stay consistent, and they need to produce to make ourselves another top 10 defense at the same time. Last but not least, it's kind of interesting because not every team has one of these every year, but we actually have a competition for kicker. Sounds kind of dumb, but one of the things is Joey Sly was our kicker last year. He came in from Carolina, strong, short little dude, power leg, almost like a Saquon Barkley leg. Can make the 50, 55-yard field goals. The problem is his chip shots, i.e. extra points, is where he kind of struggled last year. We need all those extra points. So they brought in Michael Badgley from Detroit. Guy is kind of the polar opposite of Joey Sly, right? Short little stocky dude. It's like me going out there to kick footballs and extra points. Badgley was perfect on his extra points last year. However, he missed 4 to 5 yard field goals, and basically anything over like 40 yards, Badgley's either not got the leg for it, doesn't have the distance, or he's super inaccurate. So then the question becomes, and it's a really good question for the team and the fans as we debate this, right? Would you rather have the guy that can be money on extra points and go out there and make 40 out of 40, 45 out of 45, 50 out of 55, 50 or 55 extra points, maybe miss one and not be the guy to be looked at when your team needs a field goal 45 yards and longer? Or do you want the guy that's the workhorse and has the horse leg to kick those field goals that are 45, 50, 55, even pushing maybe 60? I think Joey Sly's long last year was 58-ish, right around the 60-yard mark. That is now suspect on extra points. That's kind of what this competition is doing. I don't know if they're really going to tie 2 roster spots for kickers. They could. Wouldn't be the first time it's done. It's been a while in team history since they've done that, carry 2 kickers. We do know that Tressway is not doing any kicking. Tressway is only punting and doing holding. So in some cases, sometimes they use punters for kickers, but Washington has already come out and said Tressway is only punting and holding, and that's it. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Kick returner right now is AG, Antonio Gibson, Byron Pringle, and Dak Milne. Punt return is Dak Milne and Jahan Dotson right now. With the change of kickoff return rules, I'm not sure if that'll change, how that might be affected. It might be strictly AG out there unless he gets hurt or has fumbleitis like sometimes he does in the backfield. And we'll see what happens with punt return. Dak Milne has to do a little bit more than just be able to return punts to make the team. He plays some other special teams, kickoff, kick return, and stuff like that. But, if he wants to make the team, especially as a solid punt returner, then, he may have to up his game as well on offense to make, wide receiver number 6, wide receiver number 7. Excuse me. I see them carrying 7 wide receivers after camp. Maybe some of those guys might be relegated to the practice squad, but we'll see what happens. One of the things that was kind of interesting before we wrap up tonight's show was just some notes that came out about training camp this year. So as we look at today's training camp, especially last Tuesday, they started pads, their first day of pads. And, the competition gets a little more amped up, a lot more realistic. We're doing hitting, we're doing trash talking, we're getting chippy. There haven't been any full-blown team brawls yet, knock on wood. But one of the things that happened today in training camp in the red zone, Jacoby Brissett outran linebacker David Mayo to the pylon, scored a touchdown. Brissett's speed is what kind of caught the attention of defenders. Chase Young called up Dante Culpepper. Hey, man, look at that. Dante Culpepper flying down the sidelines. Montez Sweat was like, hey, man, check the GPS, Brisket. A lot of guys have actually coined the term Brisket as the nickname for Jacoby Brissett, who's currently sitting at QB2. Sam Howell looked pretty sharp. He's been looking sharp the last 2 days. About every 2 out of 3 days, he's looking good. He has an off day here or there, might be throwing high, might be throwing low, a couple batted balls for interceptions, yada, yada, yada. But he's actually doing pretty good at 11 on 11. Looked pretty sharp today. Had some nice throws to while he's moving in that offense, whether he's rolling out, whether he's bootlegging, running an RPO, etc. Had two beautiful balls today, both to Terry McLaurin, of which Terry makes the catch. That's kind of expected from Terry every day now, but you kind of know that that's what you're getting from Terry. Strictly on the defensive side, Montez Sweat was noted just for outright murdering people today on the offensive line, especially in one-on-ones, not only with some of the other defensive guys, but especially some of the offensive linemen in one-on-one drills, which then correlated into the 7-on-7s. When they go to 11-on-11s, they're kind of able to scheme a little bit better to kind of isolate different defensive line guys. But when Montez Sweat is working that one-on-one, he's hard to stop, which is what we want to see from him, Chase Young, Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne. So it's interesting that Coach Rivera gave a pretty unique press conference today after the morning practice that he's talking to – he had some players come to him over the – I guess today's Tuesday, so yesterday and even this morning after practice, talking about EB, Eric Bieniemy, who is the new offensive coordinator, his intensity. As many of you know, EB has a very loud, a very hard, a very accountable work ethic and practice regimen that he brings with him, and that intensity is part of that, right? So he's going hard. He's yelling at you when you're making mistakes. He's holding people accountable when they're not doing their assignments, when they're committing penalties, when they're not running the right route, when they're lollygagging, etc. He's calling them out in practice. Fans hear it. Fans love it. It's something that we haven't seen as a team. So certain players who remain to be identified, but we kind of can take a guess here and there maybe, went to coach and said that they were concerned about the intensity that EB was bringing to practice as for training camp each day. Ron Rivera had the great response that, hey, well, number one, we're not going to change the intensity that EB is bringing to practice. That's the new culture, the new way. It's what EB is doing. It's how he's preparing you guys to play in the games, practice at training camp, get used to it. And, oh, by the way, if you have a problem with the intensity or have something that EB is doing, go talk to EB. Meet with him. See what he has to say. Which then kind of raises a flag to the fans, right? That like, well, if EB's practices are so hard and intense, and you see guys not necessarily falling out, but they're gassed at the end of practice. What was happening for the last 3 to 4 years with Scott Turner? Is that why we came out lackadaisical and unprepared in week 1 or week 2, and we always had slow starts to the season? I love Paul's comment at the bottom there. It says, he loves Bieniemy's practice. EB goes 120% hard every day, all day, and it makes the gameplay easier. And, you share that same philosophy with EB. And that's what EB said in a press conference yesterday afternoon was, hey, look, I run my practices hard. I run my guys hard. We run plays. We run them over again. It's repetition. It's consistency. It's, not only is it them guys trying to learn a new offense, trying to learn new schemes, but if I can get these guys to practice hard and stay hard, it's going to make the games easy. It's going to make them prepared. It's going to make them consistent. It's going to be disciplined. It's going to be holding our guys accountable, which then, as I just alluded to a couple of minutes ago, well, what was happening last year in DC? Like, was there no intensity? Was there no preparation? A lot of times after losses, let's call it as it is, Ron Rivera would come back and say, hey, we got to look at the tape. Jay Gruden did the same thing, so it wasn't just Ron Rivera. But we'll look at the tape and we'll get our guys ready for next week. We'll do better next week, whatever. And it's just amazing to see even those small things that coaches can do have that effect on the team already. So it's interesting that, those are the guys that kind of put things together and change that focus for the players. You know, I see it rubbing off on players. You see guys in their press conferences, Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, even Logan Thomas, right? That are being like, hey, look, it's been nothing but great since EB came in. You know, the level of attention to detail, the attention to intensity, the attention to physical conditioning and training and just learning the playbook and running plays and the accountability almost seems like it's 180 degrees from where we were last year. So while I'm not looking for the soft start again this year, it gives me optimism that we might just start a little bit better than what we did last season, maybe. But as we look over the next week or two, we're going to dive into the schedule, and we certainly don't have an easy schedule. But you're absolutely right, Paul. Football camp has basically become a diva camp for a lot of teams. No hard practice, limited reps. But when we look at the Kansas City Chiefs over the last 3 to 4 or 5 years, and especially EB being there, the hard practices is what has been winning championships. You know, Patrick Mahomes, if you watch the Netflix special Quarterback, you know, Patrick Mahomes alludes to a couple times. Look, I've been to the conference final, the conference championship the last 4 years, won 2 Super Bowls, lost one, you know, and a lot of that is to the credit of Eric Bieniemy. You know, one of the things, and you're absolutely right, that NFL training camp is basically becoming a diva camp. You know, we're getting rid of preseason games. We're limiting the amount that the players are doing. I didn't even know this until this year, but maybe it was part of the new collective bargaining agreement that practice time lengths had to be staggered this year. So, like, I don't know the exact breakdown, but let's say the first 3 days to a week or whatever it was could only be 60 minutes. Then it went 65 minutes, 75 minutes, 90 minutes, 100 minutes. Like, coaches couldn't just arbitrarily be like, hey, we're practicing for 2 hours today. You know, like they were, you know, the CBA now dictates, you know, these guys can only practice an hour. These guys can only practice an hour and 10 minutes. These guys can only practice, you know, like, it's like they're ramping themselves up. What the hell is 5 minutes difference going to make? So one of the things that, you know, our players, because EB is bringing the intensity, and he's basically running the practice, really, let's be honest. Ron Rivera has given him that latitude, especially, is they're running hard and they're running practice until the stopwatch stops. And I think last year they would stop early. They wouldn't have that intensity. They'd take it easy at the end. They'd get ready for the autograph session, you know, whatever it was. You know, and here literally these guys are working until the last whistle blows. And the team's like, all right, we're done for the day. So we're going to see how that correlates into the regular season. I'm hoping that is ramping these guys up for a really good, healthy start. And we'll see what happens Friday night. Friday night, to answer your question, Paul, we play Cleveland at Cleveland in preseason. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Cleveland. Cleveland played last week in a Hall of Fame game. The only problem was, and let's be honest, nobody takes the Hall of Fame game seriously. So majority of the Hall of Fame starters, or the Cleveland Browns starters, didn't play in the Hall of Fame game. No Deshaun Watson, no starting running back, no starting wide receivers. Myles Garrett didn't play on defense. You know, like they're all in street clothes last week. So those guys are going to play this week. Question is going to be, how much are those guys going to play? Me personally, if I'm coach here and I want to see our guys, especially as we know that each preseason game, the starters get less and less. If Cleveland has their ones out there, I would expect our ones to be out there, whether it's offense or defense. Even to the fact of, you know, if Cleveland decides, hey, look, we're only playing our ones for one quarter or something, then let's leave our offensive ones out there. Nothing can go wrong with leaving our ones out there for at least the first half. Sam, as I alluded to earlier, Sam Howell needs those reps. The first team offensive line needs those reps. They need those reps to gel with each other, to communicate with each other, to figure out schemes, to figure out blocking, to figure out who's going where, doing what, coverages and audibles and all kinds of stuff, you name it. So the only way we can do that is to put the ones, especially on offense, out there for the first half. I don't think we need to necessarily go 3 quarters with the ones, maybe, but at least get a solid first half of nothing but the ones. Yes, you run the risk of injury. You do in every game, especially preseason. You run the risk of injury in camp. Let's be honest, especially at the intensity rate that EB's bringing. If we're not dropping like flies in camp with torn ACLs, Achilles, sprained ankles, and everything else under the sun, then I would think that a preseason game is going to be easier than EB's training camp, right? So we'll see what happens on Friday night. One of the things that's going to be interesting, and I'm pretty sure it's next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, it's 2 days. We are traveling to Baltimore to do inter-team practices with a different team, which I think can only benefit us, right? We've been looking at the same guys, the same plays, the same runs, the same formations, yada, yada, yada. The list goes on in training camp. And I think not only for our offensive line and our number ones on offense and number twos, but also the defense, right? The defense needs some new personnel, needs some new looks, needs some fresh guys in there. And I think Baltimore is going to bring that valuable training opportunity to us. And I hope that we can do the same for them. Let's be honest, Lamar Jackson, can he return to his old form and be a prolific quarterback like he's been over the last couple of seasons? Not necessarily last season. It's only going to be better for us as a team as we prepare to get ready for the regular season. So one of the things, as we look forward to next week, we'll see how that 4-2-5 set works. As Paul says, the 4-2-5 keeps the defense honest, but it also makes that front four work and achieve to apply the pressure to play the run gaps. But I think we can do that with the 4 guys that we have up front. So with that being said, some of the things we're going to look at next week is obviously another update on training camps, maybe the update on the depth chart as well, see if anything changes, see how injuries play into this week. We'll have a review of the Cleveland preseason game that happened on Friday night, and we may be into the first day of inter-team practice with Baltimore. I'm pretty sure that's next Tuesday. I'll have to check. And then we may even dive into the regular season preview as we start. So with that being said, I'm going to sign off here for another episode of Commander's Gridiron. Have a good night, and God bless.